Welcome to FaithX. Today I'm interviewing Leow, who's the faculty at BGST. He's also the founder of KIN, which is Koinonia Inclusion Network, and he's the former chair of the advisory panel for Kindergarten, which is Singapore's first fully inclusive preschool, and he's also in the management committee of St. Andrew's Autism Centre. Wow, that's quite a mouthful. Welcome, Leow.
Thanks, Samuel.
Right. Perhaps you can explain to us, for our audience, like you have a passion for working and loving people with special needs. Maybe you can explain what drives this passion.
Well, it's very similar to coming to faith in Christ. I received a call, and then I got converted. So many years ago, about 2012, I received a call. And that call was from a volunteer agency that said, would you like to volunteer at AWA? Then at that point of time, I had no idea what AWA was. So I said, what's AWA? And then they told me that it was a place where the school cared for children with moderate to severe disabilities. So I said, okay. Just before that, a few weeks ago, I had prayed to God, asking Him for direction, because I was going to full-time ministry and I was not sure where I should volunteer. And I said, to the Lord, if you would like me to continue volunteering, can you give me a call to a place where I can serve a group of people that really needed some help. And so when I got this call, I thought it was very obvious, so I said yes immediately. But when I went in, I went in with the idea that I wanted to help people with special needs. But that's when I got converted. Because after I started working with people with special needs, I started to realize that they were not a group of people with special needs. They are people. And so the more I interacted with them, I realized that they had a lot of personality, of course. They had their own hopes and dreams, their own strengths and weaknesses. I learned a lot from them, and many of them became my friends. And we had a relationship where we would bless each other. And so my conversion was that, I came to a point where I realized that I really loved having them around. And I thought to myself, if, they were such a blessing to me, wouldn't they be a blessing to the church as well? And so, that's where I really started thinking very hard about this and thinking that the church should have them within the church, not so that we can pity them and serve them, but so they can bless us as well.
It's quite counterintuitive, because we often think that people with special needs, right? Needs have to be served, right? And then often it becomes a case where we we try to euphemize it. Oh, right, serving is a joy, when actually what you are trying to say is that very much these people are a burden, right? But when you say you are blessed by people with special needs or what, I'm not sure which term you use. What encounters do you have?
Yeah, I think it's so many different encounters, but let me tell you about one of my favorite stories. Okay. In 2018, I was going through a period of depression. I had overworked myself, and I was just about to fly off to study, and so I wasn't in a good situation. And so I went to visit a friend, and she had a daughter, and the daughter had intellectual disabilities, and we have been friends for a long time. And her daughter gave to me, those type of little piggy mooncakes that we used to give to little children. It comes in those type of plastic basket one. Yeah, cute one. Yeah.
So even know, does it still exist?
I don't know. I also don't know. But yeah. So she gave me 3 of those piggy mooncakes. Then I was like, okay I'm greedy, so I just take and eat right? Because I want to eat also. But I didn't know why she gave it to me, So, but when I thought about it, when I went home, I realized, that's the reason. And the reason was because a year ago, when I met this girl for the first time, I was telling her about the story of the 3 little pigs.
Oh.
And she remembered. And ever since, so I called the mother and asked her, so is that why she gave me the 3 little pigs? She said yes, because every time she sees pigs, she thinks about you, and she wants to care for you and wants to bless you. And so that's why she bought the 3 little pigs mooncakes for you. And at that point of time, I was so stressed already. And I was just thinking, it's such a blessing to receive this unexpected gift from a sister who you thought maybe wouldn't even remember you, but in fact always thought about you and just wanted to find different ways to bless you. In fact, you go to my house right now, you'll see other pigs around the house.
Oh, from the
That's
same.
because from the same girl, because she kept on passing these different pigs to me wherever they went for holiday, right? She'll buy something and pass it over to me. And this is one example, of many times where, persons with special needs have blessed me in so many different ways.
Right, so from the time that you responded to a call to be a volunteer to what you're doing presently, before I even talk about Kin, right, which you founded, what's the journey been like? What were you doing prior? You said you were going to enter full-time ministry. So what were you doing?
Yeah, before that I was a teacher in a mainstream school, and so I knew nothing about special needs, which is why when I received the call, right, the first thing I said to the person online was, you know I don't know anything about special needs, right? So but the person said, yes, we don't mind, because what we want is some of your leadership experience. So I said, okay, I'll join. But at that point of time, I really had no idea why the Lord had called me to serve persons with special needs. And in fact, around that time, I served with AWA for about 3 years as I was doing my MDiv at seminary to train, the basic training for a pastor.
All while also being a teacher?
Yeah, but while also serving partially at AWA. But as I was serving, I didn't really know why I was doing it. I did it because I thought it was a good cause. But when I graduated from seminary, something very interesting happened. I was about to take on a part-time role as a pastor while I continued to study at seminary. But then my wife was pregnant with our second child. She had a difficult pregnancy. And I promised her that after I graduated from seminary, I would spend more time with her and care for her more. So she said, okay, you promised me, right? So I said, okay, I promise you. So now that you are having a difficult pregnancy, I will go to the church and tell them I can't take on the role. I'll go to the seminary and tell them I'm not going to start my studies. So suddenly I graduated already, I had nothing to do, right? Except for care for my family. So I was seeking the Lord for direction. I said, no, Lord, why do you make me study so hard for 3 years only to have nothing to do after I graduated? And after much prayer, I felt the Lord saying to me, hey, there's a reason why I made you serve in AWA for the last 3 years. So I thought to myself, could it be that the Lord wants me to think about how persons with special needs could be brought into the church? And so that's where I really seriously started to think about it. So after that, what I did was I went to one of the seminaries, BGST, the Biblical Graduate School of Theology. And I said to them, I have some experience working with people with special needs. Could I teach a course on this? And, I'm the kind of person that when I teach something, I also learn as I prepare for the course. So they said yes, they're very kind. And so I taught the course 2 times. And after that, I started to learn so much about the Christian scene, right? Because it's a Christian course. So I started to learn a lot about Christian scene. I started to learn about what ministries are out there, what are the needs of the ministry. And that gave me more and more conviction that there was a need to set up an organization to bring together all the different disability ministries and also to support the different disability ministries. Yeah, so that's what happened in the interim time.
Which is Kin right
Yeah,
now.
which is eventually developed into Kin.
Oh. So what were the needs that you saw which I assume that you are trying to galvanize and pull these resources and ministries together. It's not just a network, right? The fact you have an official organization right now. Like, what were the needs that you saw?
Yeah, so Kin is a sector empowerment organization, right? We want to support church-based disability ministries. So some of the obvious needs that we saw were, first of all, many of these ministries, they were driven by very passionate leaders, which is fantastic. But the ministry, was already so tiring, right? It takes so much energy to run a ministry from a week-to-week basis. So the leaders were saying things like, how can I get my members trained? I already have my hands full, right? How can I myself develop as a person? I already have my hands full. And, if we do this week after week, can we learn from other people? Can we network with other people? Can we partner with other people? And so it's because of this kind of needs, we said, there is really value for a group that is not tied down in the church, so to speak, to help to bring everyone together so that we can help to level everyone together. And it also brings, all the different churches closer together as well, which is a wonderful thing to us.
So it's It's pretty much sharing best practices lah.
It's both sharing best practices but also trying to level up the sector. Because the sector in Singapore is still relatively new as things go, right? So there are many practices and things that, you know, ministries as a whole haven't thought through very, very deeply. So for example, one area that is a real challenge is the area of sexuality. Right? So when a person with special needs turns 12 or 13, right, and they start to go through puberty, and the person starts to experience sexual desire for the opposite gender, how do you manage that person in the church setting? What happens if a boy with autism starts to display inappropriate behavior towards the opposite gender? What if he does inappropriate behavior in class? Because of his sexual needs. It's something that I don't think churches have thought through as deeply as they need to because they're so busy. So it's really helpful to have a group that brings together some of the expertise that is in Singapore and also outside of Singapore to help to address very practical issues like these.
Are you talking about mainly intellectual disabilities?
For King, what we try to do, because we want to serve the church, is we address those disabilities that are the most challenging for the church. So we, in particular, the 3 disability groups that we try to aim for are intellectual disabilities, autism, and then dementia. Because most churches don't really understand what is happening for people with these kinds of disabilities. So for example, in contrast, a person who is blind, I think it's easier for us to empathize with a person who's blind. We understand they cannot see. But for a person with autism, I find that many people don't understand the experience of a person with autism. And so Kin specifically tries to address these kinds of disabilities. Even though our training programs often are broader than that, we address other kinds as well. But our main focus is these 3.
Right. I think from my experience, perhaps because churches may not have been inclusive, right? How big is the problem really? You know, like do people with disabilities form a large proportion? I mean, like talk about intellectual, talk about autism, talk about dementia, right? How big are these things?
Yeah, so this disability is a real, genuine social issue in Singapore. So the statistics vary, but a simple number that I find very helpful to remember is that 1 in 14 people in Singapore have a disability of some kind. And to make that even more concrete, it's, in other words, about 1 person in every small group, or 1 person in every row of pews.
Is that even welcome lah?
Yeah. So the question we ask is that what we see in church? Do we see 1 person with special needs in every small group? So if that's not what we see, then maybe the reason why we don't see that is because our churches are not as welcoming as they need to be in order to address the real demographics of the nation. But on top of that, if you look at things like the government, every 5 years the government comes out with this thing called the Enabling Master Plan. And the current Enabling Master Plan, Enabling Master Plan 3, has identified that disability is only going to increase into the future. And the main driver for this is aging. When we age, we become more frail. Our mind also goes through changes. And so when you cross from the age group to 50 and above, the amount of people with disability grows by 3 times.
Oh.
Yeah, so the older your church gets, the more people with disabilities you're going to have. And as you know, Singapore is an aging population. So the social concern of disability is only going to rise. So if churches are concerned about being relevant to the world that we are called to minister to, disability is not something we can walk away from or turn a blind eye to.
Right, so how, in your advisory, right, how do we get churches to be inclusive?
Well, I think there are 2 main ways, right? A very wise friend of mine said, what are churches called to be? They're called to be 2 things. We're called to be faithful and we're called to be relevant. Faithful and relevant. So usually when I work with churches and help them to get to think about disability, I remind them of these 2 things, right? So relevance, we just talked about just now. The statistics in Singapore are very real. Right. One thing I didn't mention is, for example, that right now the statistics show about 100,000 people in Singapore have dementia. 100,000 people in Singapore have dementia. It's not a small issue, right?
That's about 100 churches failed. Essentially.
Yeah, can you imagine that, right?
Yeah.
So it's about 1 in 10 elderly have dementia, you know. So if you want to be relevant to your own church members, in fact, if you want to be relevant to yourself as you grow older, you better have a disability ministry. So that's the first thing we say to churches. But actually the issue goes even deeper, right? So why are we churches? We are churches because we believe in the gospel of Jesus Christ. So what does it mean to be faithful, right? We just now said to be faithful to that gospel. So that requires, as we think through the Bible, what I try to remind churches is, I ask them the question, what kind of church did Jesus call us to be? Right? What kind of church did Jesus call us to be? When Jesus says, go and make the disciples of all the nations, did he say, go and make disciples of only able-bodied people? Obviously not, right? So all the nations includes people with disabilities. On top of that, we also know that Jesus says he has a real heart for the last, the lost, and the least, the marginalized. And who else is marginalized in society other than people with disabilities? So God wants people with disabilities in our church. But even more than that, right? Even more than these kind of reasons, God calls people with disabilities into our church to be prophets to us. To be prophets. Why? In the Bible, we learn so much about the value of God's strength in our weakness, right? People with disabilities are like us. They cannot hide their disabilities, right? If you don't have an arm, you don't have an arm. You can't hide it, right? So when they are in our midst, they are a living reminder to us of all our weakness and all our brokenness. Just by being in our presence, they remind us of our human limitedness. They remind us of who we truly are. And that's why they're prophets to us. And so when we don't have them in our community, we can lie to ourselves. We can pretend we are something other than human. And these are just all the different reasons that the Bible gives to call us to welcome persons with special needs into our midst. Yeah, so that's usually how I try to convince churches, both faithfulness and relevance.
I think just now you mentioned about a particular need, especially some children who go through puberty and then they don't know how best to express their sexual needs and sexual desires. Like, you have any advice, like what goes into training, like people to serve, in this area?
Yeah, I think the training that we need to consider is, first of all, is broader than just the person with special needs, right? Partially, we need to help the community have an accurate understanding of biblical sexuality and how it is expressed. If not, when a young person is going through puberty and is starting to express themselves in different ways, the tendency for the community is to respond with, why is he like that, right? And that kind of cultural response does not facilitate the person with special needs to feel accepted and to feel understood, right? Because you don't want to shame the child into what we think to be correct behavior either. So at the same time, obviously we need to help the child understand that the behavior is inappropriate. But that's not going to happen overnight. Which is why it's so important then that the rest of the class understands what is happening with this individual at that point of time. So part of in fact, a lot of our training does not focus on the persons with disabilities. A lot of our training focuses on the community and how the community responds to the person who is acting inappropriately. Let me give you an example, okay? So a person with autism, so I'm not using a puberty example, but another example, right? So a person with autism will sometimes clap very loudly, right? So we understand this because sometimes persons with autism need to clap loudly in order to stimulate their senses. Because they are different than us, their brains operate differently than us, they need audio stimulation, which is why they clap their hands very loudly. So are you going to tell this person, for example, not to do this? It's like, when I take a chalk and I go on the chalkboard and there's that screeching sound, what do? You try not to hear it, right? You don't want to hear it, right? Can I tell you, actually, I want you to love that sound. I can't tell you that either, right? It's your physiology, it's your sensory response to it. So now we go back to the issue of, let's say, sexuality, right? For that child, as we help the person adjust, are you just going to say, if you're not going to change your behavior instantaneously, we're going to keep you out? We can't do that. So what we need to do is to help the community understand the changes and the experiences that this person is going through over time, give the person sufficient time and space to grow as well. Of course, we can have adaptation procedures in the classroom. Let's say if the child needs, at that point of time, and hasn't learned to control his sexual urges, we can usher the child to somewhere else in the meantime, right? But more important than telling the child exactly what to do, which is school will also help him, is to teach the community the right way to respond to the child as the child is growing. So one of the lovely churches we go to, Chapel of Christ Our Hope. This is a church that is very friendly to persons with autism. So when I preach in that church, I always expect people to be clapping for me in the middle of the service.
Wow, I like that.
Yeah, and I expect people to come and hug me in the middle of the service.
Really?
It's okay. It's okay, right? In fact, they are teaching us how we should accept, let's say, little kids. When little kids are making noise in our congregations, we should tell their parents, it's okay, you are welcome here. So the change that we try to bring across in our training is not necessarily helping to change the person with special needs. Their schools are there to do that. Their therapists are there to do that. What we are trying to do is help the community transform into a patient and loving community that welcomes the person, despite the fact they are limited and they are growing. Because that's what we want for all of us. I also need space to make mistakes, to say silly things, to do wrong things. I need grace from you. Even as we are doing this podcast, I probably have done silly things. In fact, I did something silly already, right? But you have given me grace. And that's the kind of church that we want to develop.
Wow, so basically a lot of the training is teaching the congregants how to show grace to the in a sense the really obtrusive, like socially unacceptable behavior which makes us cringe lah, pretty much, right?
Yeah, it's teaching us about understanding, right? So it's very funny. Recently I really didn't expect this pastor to say this. So recently I went to do a awareness talk at the church, and the pastor said to me, "Hey, your training, can I send my whole church for your training?" So I said, wait, why do you need to send your whole church, right? So he said, but your training sounds like you're teaching people how to be Christian. I said, actually, you're right. Isn't this fundamentally the kind of community that we want to develop? A community that doesn't judge you, a community that tries to understand you as an individual, as a community that gives you space to grow, even while it is trying to help you grow, right? We are not saying don't grow, remain as you are, but we are saying, yeah, be free to be yourself, be free to know Jesus and grow together with Jesus, and we'll support you in that journey. So that's what we do.
Oh, wow, okay. During our Zoom call, you did mention something about how people with special needs suffer a lot more during COVID. Particularly when churches go online. Maybe you can elaborate more about that.
Yeah, I think for example, during the circuit breaker last year, right, the first thing that Kin did was we decided to launch a month of prayer in response, because it was quite traumatic for many families. Why is that the case? I can think of at least two reasons up front. I think the first thing is, people often assume that people with special needs don't need friends, right? They are as though they are a different kind of human being altogether. And maybe a person with autism doesn't appear that they understand social relationships. That's why we assume that. But that's the furthest from the truth. If you get to know people with disabilities, you will find out that they want friends just as much as you and I do. In fact, many of them don't have friends who are so-called typical friends, right? If their friends is another person with special needs. So one of the major problems during COVID was that real desire for friendship was not met, right? When you meet online, the kind of experience is not as rich. And so many persons with special needs really, really struggled during that period of time. The other reason is more like to do with their disabilities, right? Their senses. For example, persons with autism, some persons with autism will struggle with visual stimulation. So one reason why a person with autism doesn't look you in the eye when they talk to you, you often see they look at the floor or look at the wall when they're talking to you. One reason is because persons with autism sometimes have overstimulation. Their visual processing is overstimulated. So when they look at your face, right, it looks like your face is vibrating. You know, like when we watch those type of movies where they film it on the camera and the camera keeps shaking, and it's very hard to actually look at the screen. That's how they experience the world as well.
Oh.
So can you imagine you force them to sit in front of a Zoom and watch the Zoom, how that will feel like to a person whose vision is already overly stimulated. Now you add to that for a person who has hearing concerns, and you add whatever you need to add, right? A person who is hyperactive. It's really difficult to sit them in a Zoom setting, which is why the face-to-face kind of work that we do in churches, that churches do is so important, which is why circuit breaker was really difficult. And if I could think of one more reason, it's because many persons with special needs thrive on routines. They like things to happen in predictable ways. In particular for persons with autism, this is the case, which is why, you go to a special school, you walk into a classroom, usually the schedule will be very big and on the wall.
Sorry?
The schedule for the day, it will be very big and written on the wall, so that when the student comes into class, they know exactly what's going to happen, step 1, step 2, step 3. But now, of course, in circuit breaker, all your routines change. You're stuck at home all the time. Can you imagine what will happen to them, the kind of response they will have? So it's very difficult for many families during the circuit breaker period, which is why when we started to ease, many families, they were like, finally.
I serve in some youth ministries, and sometimes it's a bit hard to get parents to accept that their children may have special needs, and sometimes we want to advise the parent to get their children checked out, but they are very resistant to it. Maybe you can explain to us like why and how do we deal with it?
Yeah, thanks for asking this question. I want to first affirm that it's a very real concern. Whenever we do training with disability ministry leaders, it's an issue that they constantly bring up because they see so many children, and so whenever they see a child who has a special need, they also know that the earlier that you identify the child, the earlier the intervention goes, the better for the child, and so they want to convey it to the parents. But when they do, many parents are often resistant. But at the same time, of course, we need to be very empathetic towards the parents to understand why they are feeling that way. And I think the major reason is because when we have a child, we're always telling ourselves stories about the child. I have 3 children, and before any of our children were born, we were already looking forward to the child. We were choosing a name. We were thinking what the name means. We were talking about buying clothes for the child and what kind of aspirations we have for the child. Every parent is like that. But when a parent has to confront that their child may have a special needs, many of their dreams and hopes for the child have to change, because they know that the child will not be exactly like what they aspire for the child to be. And so the parent goes through a phase where they have to tell themselves new stories. But that is very challenging. And in fact, some of the research has shown that process of coming to acceptance about your child having a special needs is akin to bereavement, right? Coming to terms with death. And if you think about it, it's almost like you're dying to your story and you're trying to restart a new story. And so we need to understand that parents go through a difficult process. And so one of the key things we need to do is therefore to do anything that we do with someone who's bereaving, which is to be a friend and be present with the family as they go through that process. They're much more likely to believe and accept what you say if they consider that you are a friend. You're not just trying to diagnose their child, but if they have conviction that what you're saying is for the best interest of the family. And all this idea of the best interest of the family is at the heart of what we need to do in order to convince them to bring their child to get a proper diagnosis. Because for many of these families, having that diagnosis is a loss to them, right? It feels as though they have lost something from their child. But we need to help the parents see that actually getting the diagnosis is something good for the child. It adds something to the child. It helps them understand their child better. It helps them have a better relationship with their child. In fact, it helps their child grow and blossom to become the child that God has made the child to be. And so I think that's the key in trying to communicate with parents, helping them see the good in the diagnosis and helping them see the good in their child.
Wow. Right. I think for Christians like those in ministry, right, we encounter many people with like various special needs, right? You mentioned 3 types, right? Intellectual needs, intellectual disabilities, autism, and dementia. Maybe you can go through with us for each of these 3, right? What does it look like? Yeah.
Look like, and also how we should care for them in church. Yeah. Of course, even all these 3 categories are very broad in nature, right? Already. Yeah, it's a spectrum, right? But generally for intellectual disability, the diagnostic criteria is related to your level of IQ, so your processing and your adaptability to situations. So if that is the case, then churches could do quite a number of things to adapt. So one of the things is simply to think very carefully about the words that we use in the classroom. Sometimes I go to a Sunday school class, right? And I'm quite shocked by the kinds of words we use even for 5 years or 6 year olds, right? Well, we go into a class and we start talking about justification.
Sanctification.
Yeah, because we're so used to using these words, right? Or even the word Christ. One of the tricky things I like to do as an Old Testament lecturer is ask people, what does Christ mean? So what does Christ mean, right? Most of us think it's like Jesus' surname. But Christ is actually a very loaded word. It has a lot of meaning. It means Messiah. It means the one that's anointed. So if we're not careful, we use words like this for little children and they don't understand. And so likewise, for persons who are intellectually disabled, we need to choose our words carefully. We need to present our ideas carefully. So, I have the blessing of preaching at the church for persons with autism. And so when I prepare my sermon, what do? I make sure I use words that are short and sharp, 1 or 2 syllables. I use words that are very concrete, easy to understand. Rather than saying sanctification, we just say growing, right? We use a lot of pictures, and not complicated pictures, but simple pictures. And we try to reduce the number of points we're trying to make. Right? Not a 3-point sermon, a 1-point sermon. So by doing these kind of adaptations, I can assure you that the child will understand better, and probably everyone else will understand better as well if we take pains to communicate clearly. Persons with autism have a different set of challenges. Some of them will also be intellectually disabled, but most persons with autism, the primary challenge they face are social difficulties. They have difficulties relating and understanding another person's mind. So for example, when I say something, you can guess what I'm thinking in my mind. A person with autism will find that challenging. So we can help them very simply, especially in the classroom, by being very clear, very plain. Often in our language, we use a lot of indirect language, right? For example, would you like to sit on the chair? Right? That is an indirect language. What we are asking the person is sit on the chair, right? So for a person with autism, we should say, sit on the chair, not would you like to sit on the chair. We could also help by, as I mentioned earlier on, providing the child with a schedule that will help the child understand what's going to happen in the classroom. It will allow the child to have a greater sense of security. And then depending on the child's, let's say, level of communication, sometimes using pictures rather than words can be very, very effective in communication. So, but again, I'm only, scraping the surface of what we can do in the classroom. You mentioned finally dementia. Now, dementia is a very different set of challenges, because most people who have dementia normally start as people who are fully have their full mental capacities. They go through a process where they slowly lose their memory and other mental faculties. So this is of course, a very different set of challenges, right? Because the first thing we need to help the person do is go through a period of acceptance. Recently, there was a Salt and Light article that was really, really very moving, talking about a pastor who was ministering to his wife who had dementia. And so the pastors, there was this very beautiful story where they were in bed, sleeping, and then the wife turned to the husband and said, I'm so afraid that I will forget you. Then the husband said, you shouldn't be afraid. You should be afraid that I will forget you. And after the husband said that to calm her down, right, she went to sleep. And then the husband told a story of how he started crying after that. And he cried himself to sleep. And so part of the work that we do, particularly with the dementia community, is to help the community come around the family to provide them that support as they go through that process where they are almost losing the person as the dementia progresses. Dementia you can break it up into 3 broad phases, right? One is when the person is still able to participate actively in the community, but experience, let's say, memory loss at different times of their journey. Then there comes a point where it becomes more serious and more pronounced. And finally, there comes a point where it gets to them being at home and they can't leave the home anymore for various reasons. The church, in fact, needs to think of different models of care for these different phases. What does it mean to do church when your members can't even come to church? In fact, COVID has helped us to understand this a little bit better, right? So, one idea we were just tossing around was, when we come to church, can there be a room where we can Zoom with members who can't come to church? So we all come to church together, but then some of us go to a separate room in church where we can say hi to our brothers and sisters who, for some reason or another, cannot be in church. So, it's another way to think about how to use Zoom to reach out to people who can't be present with us. But really, this is as you can tell, it's a really social issue that the church needs to think through carefully.
So, I think there are a lot of theological questions that we can ask about it, like things like like why does God create people with autism, and why do people go through dementia? Do you have an understanding about why this happens?
Well, the why question is very, very difficult, right? Because it's very hard for us to come up with an answer just like that. The discovery of the reason of why is a journey. Is usually a journey that a person has to take. When we look at scripture, we see multiple reasons for why a person can have a disability, right? One reason, you see that in John 9 with the man born blind. When the disciples asked Jesus, why was this man born blind? Jesus says, this man was born blind so that he can reveal the works of God. So sometimes people have disabilities in order to glorify God, right? But sometimes we also see, for example, in the story in Genesis 3, that why a person might have a disability, in this case Eve, is because the person has sinned. And that's entirely possible too, right? It's possible that if let's say I drive recklessly and I get into an accident and I lose a limb and I become disabled, my disability is related to some act of sin as well. So the first thing we tell people when they think about this theological issue of why is first of all, don't be too quick to make a judgment, right? Honestly, you also don't know, right? It's a process of discernment. And so that's the key thing that the church needs to be able to do with the person. To know that God has possibly many reasons for why a person has disability. And the church's role is not first to just tell the person what that reason is, but rather to come alongside the person to co-discern the reason together. So now as an individual, I've been very open in sharing usually about my own depression journey, because it's how I came to also partially why I want to serve people with special needs, right? And so now in hindsight, it's very easy for me to tell you that I strongly believe that one of the reasons why God gave me depression is so that I will have empathy for those who are suffering. But if you had told me this 20 years ago when I was struggling with this as a teenager, I wouldn't have accepted that, because I was not ready for that kind of answer. And what I needed was brothers and sisters who journey alongside me in order for me to understand that reason. And one of the most wonderful people that did that was my wife, which is why she's my wife, right?
For people that are looking after people with special needs, right? I think it's very easy to get discouraged. When looking after the youth that I did, it's very easy to get drained, and I only see them like 4 hours every Saturday, and that's it, But then like for those that have to take care of children with special needs or parents with special needs, like it can be it can suck out a lot of energy. Like, do you have any advice or encouragement for these people?
Yeah. First of all, I want to say to, if you're in a situation like that certainly I want to thank you for the amount of effort you have put in, to love your child. I want you to know that, God knows that, God sees that, and it's precious to Him. It's not something that's wasted. In fact, God delights when we spend time loving, a child with special needs. That's the first thing I think, parents and caregivers must know. I think the other thing I would encourage them to do is also don't allow themselves to be in a small bubble of their own family. I think it's very easy to do that, obviously, because they want to care for their families. But it's really important to get yourself into a network where you can meet other parents and hear how God is working in those families as well. Because when I think you are going through a difficult period, it's helpful to hear from another parent how God has led them out of a period like that, so you can receive some encouragement. In fact, it's really because of this that, in 2018, we wrote a book called Call Me By Name. And that book was just a collection of stories where we brought together stories of Christians with special needs, their families, and people who serve persons with special needs. And as you read these stories, I think you understand that God can work in different ways, but also God can work in the long run. And so it's important to see a bigger perspective, which is very challenging when you're struggling or you're challenged at the very moment. So try to move out of your bubble. The third thing I would like to say to families who are struggling is, of course, that God is with you. But I find it hard to say that. Not because I don't think that God is not with them, but because I think to myself, now how can I show you that God is with you? And that's why I just say to all my brothers and sisters out there, the way that we show families that God is with them is if we are with them, right? We are the way that God loves them and cares for them. So I can only tell that family that God loves them if the community comes together and loves them as God intended to. So let us come together as one people of God to love these families, love their children. And in that way, we can clearly proclaim to them, the Lord is with you. And I think that's the most important thing I can say to a family right now.
Wow, thank you so much. But I think we have come to the end of our interview. I'll have given you like 2 minutes to say a takeaway, but I think you essentially said that already. yeah. Unless you have another like one takeaway for the general audience.
Nah, I think you're right.
All right. Okay. Sure. Right. Thank you so much. Right.
Thank you.